It's on.
One.
Here, they have two specimens from Mark's tree, actually, where we were.
One, two, three, testing.
I'm gonna end the stream really quickly.
Nope.
Hi.
Nope.
Okay.
Just.
That's great. Elizabeth Hankel, the director of the museum.
Hi, nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Welcome to Arkansas.
Yeah, that's how I do my jobs too. I worry too much about. Oh, yeah. You know, if we have, there's
Just got that like.
Good evening. Welcome to our keynote speaker for this year's Darwin Day events. I'm Dr. Drew Sweet. I'm the chair of the Darwin Day Committee here at Arkansas State University. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Biological Sciences. This is our fourth annual Darwin Day event. We're very excited for you to be here tonight. We've had several great events throughout this week, and we're happy to have Dr. Kaebnick here to talk to us today. A few thanks before we get started. We had various organizations and people contribute financially or in other ways to this year's program. So the Beck College of Science and Mathematics, Department of Biological Sciences. We've had a little bit of funding from National Science Foundation and also from the lecture concert series here at Arkansas State. And of course, a big thank you to the Arkansas State University Museum, who's hosting our events and other events throughout this week. And if you have not visited the museum or their exhibits before, I highly encourage you to do that. And shameless plug here, between now and the rest of the month, we have a special exhibit focused on extinction in Arkansas that you can access right up here outside the auditorium. So it will be open after this talk, so if you want to go and check out some fossils and specimens of things that have recently gone extinct or are not doing so well and might be extinct in the near future, hopefully not, but please check out that exhibit and also the exhibits that are here at the museum as well. So I mentioned this is the fourth Darwin Day series of events that we have done at A-State, and we're joining with other organizations really around the world who are doing similar types of events at this time of year, thinking about ideas, information, advancements in evolutionary biology. And we do it at this time of year because of Charles Darwin's birthday. So Darwin was born February 12th, 1809, so happy 216 Chuck, it's today. There we go. And we don't necessarily focus explicitly on Charles Darwin for Darwin Day, but more so thinking about the ideas that he formulated and the impacts of those ideas have had on the way that we view biology and really the world more broadly around us. He did not invent evolution, but certainly the ideas that he formulated were important, leading to a much quoted quote by Theodosius Dobzhansky that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And so that's really how we think about biology today. Every year we choose a theme centered around something to do with evolutionary biology. And this year's theme is extinction and de-extinction. As I'm sure we'll hear in a minute here, it's a very relevant topic. Extinction played a huge role in shaping Darwin's ideas about evolution. He was originally a paleontologist, and his famous voyage on the Beagle, most of what he was trying to do was collect fossils as he was going around the world. And the ideas that things change over time, that there are things that used to exist but don't anymore, were really important for understanding evolution and how different organisms exist on Earth. And of course, the de-extinction process, which again I'll leave up to Dr. Kaebnick to talk about, is a more recent way of thinking about how we can maybe reverse that trend and if that's a good thing or not. So I'd love to introduce our speaker now, Dr. Gregory Kaebnick, who is coming to us from the Hastings Center in New York. Dr. Kaebnick did his bachelor's at Swarthmore College and then did a master's and PhD in philosophy at the University of Minnesota. And since then, he has been at the Hastings Center, where he is currently director of research. He's a research scholar, and he is the editor of the Hastings Center report, which is focused on issues related to bioethics. He's authored or edited numerous books and articles. He's had funding from the National Science Foundation, from the National Institutes of Health, and he's testified before Congress on different issues related to bioethics. So we're very pleased to have him with us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Greg Kaebnick.
Thank you, Drew. And let me add one more thank you to you guys actually for showing up. It's a beautiful day, and it's really lovely to have a good audience. And so I'm grateful to you for being here, actually. So it's a sad time for those of us who care about biodiversity. We're in the middle of what's been called the sixth great extinction event, one that's caused by human activity. There are whole taxonomic categories being diminished. many island species that are particularly precarious right now. But much of the megafauna that we had that managed to survive the ice ages now seems to be threatened. And it's painful. And by and large, most of what we have to do to slow the loss is also painful. Mostly we need to stop, we need to slow down the things that we've been doing that have been causing extinction: habitat destruction, climate change, overhunting. But in the last couple of years, there has been a little burbling and seemingly much more optimistic story to be told, that has been told, about extinction and about human activity, human meddling in the world. We might, in at least some cases, be able to reverse extinction and bring back some of what's been lost. And here are just a very small sampling of some of the species that have been mentioned as candidates for de-extinction. Starting at the upper left, that's the stellar sea cow. Going clockwise, the giant moa, and the saber-toothed cat, the dodo, and then the thylacine or Tasmanian tiger in the middle, which went extinct recently enough that we have photographs of it and actually some video that's kind of haunting to look at, actually. And just to give you a kind of some sense of how grandiose some of the ambitions are, this is another species that's been mentioned for de-extinction, Homo neanderthalensis. I am not going to talk about this particular case very much because I think it raises issues that fall a little bit outside the conservation ethics, environmental ethics category that I want to talk about. This raises questions that have a little bit more to do, I think, with human subjects research ethics. But just so you can, get a sense of what, what's afloat. Let's start instead with the thing that's been in the headlines most recently, the thing that makes the topic maybe most relevant, the dire wolf, which was a large, very muscular, dog-like creature last seen in North America around 10,000 years ago. But last year, a startup tech company named Colossal formed with the help of the Harvard scientist George Church, who's going to recur, and name will come up in my talk a few times. He's, by the way, a really lovely guy and a brilliant scientist, but he's centrally involved in this, and I will be sort of poking at it a little bit. Announced that it had created 3 dire wolf pups, which they named Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi, effectively recreating this species. It's an incredible accomplishment. There are 3 large steps that they had to take to get these pups. First thing they had to do was just to sequence the dire wolf genome. And the first thing that they had to do there was just to find the genome. With some of the species that have been considered as candidates for de-extinction, this isn't terribly difficult. They're in frozen storage or at least in museum drawers somewhere. But with many of the species that are mentioned, including the dire wolf, the genome has to be recovered from fossils. So in that kind of case, there's no single intact genome that you can go to. You have to find bits and pieces in many different locations and then assemble them all into the overall sequence. And it is an extraordinary accomplishment in and of itself. Next, they had to create a new genome that resembles that sequence at least. This is the domain of synthetic biology. The talk the testimony I gave had to do with a big synthetic biology announcement back in 2012 or so. Synthetic biology is roughly about the design and construction of novel biological systems. And the vision is that it will put into practice principles of engineering. But in practice, what actually a lot of synthetic biology is a little bit more like making some changes to existing genomes. And that's what this work, the recreation of the dire wolf, amounted to. They started off with the genome of a gray wolf, a pretty closely related species, and modified it so that it resembles the dire wolf in a few key ways. For example, they added genes for white fur and for greater size. And the next thing they had to do, they had to create an embryo that contains that genome and bring it to term. This requires actually two different tricks in sequence: cloning followed by in vitro fertilization. Here, in biology, cloning can mean different things, but in this context, it means nuclear transfer. You take a living egg, enucleate it, take the nucleus out of it, and insert a new genome and try to get the two to sort of enliven. And the result, if it works, is then an embryo, not just an altered egg, because the genome you're sticking in is diploid. It has both sets of chromosomes. An egg is haploid, has only one set, requires another set from a sperm to form an embryo. But here you have, boom, you have an embryo. And if it works, then you go through an IVF process to create a pregnancy. You insert it into a female. In this case, for this work, it's cross-species cloning and cross-species IVF that they went through. They did the cloning with dog eggs and then inserted the embryos into female dogs. And then you hope that the gestation process works normally, that the embryos will be ready to be born at the right time, and will be about the right size, won't be too large. They are different species, the embryo and the mother, so that kind of compatibility is not guaranteed right at the outset. And if all that works, then you have, well, what exactly? My view is that you have the combination of gene sequencing, genome modification, and reproductive technologies is an incredible scientific triumph, but not yet a conservation triumph. And we can walk through that by considering the other species that's been talked about a lot, the species that's garnered the most attention in the de-extinction debate, the woolly mammoth. This is the species for which the company Colossal is named, of course. Everything I've said so far about the de-extinction of the dire wolf applies with appropriate changes to the de-extinction of the mammoth. It would be created by modifying the genome of a closely related species, in this case, an Asian elephant, and that add a few mammoth traits to that. You have to sequence the mammoth genome. You add a few mammoth traits, like a domed head, more and longer fur, cold tolerance. Then you enucleate an Asian elephant egg, insert the modified genome, and bring it to term in an Asian elephant female. Would it be a woolly mammoth? Most scientists, and I think this is fair to say, and I, not a scientist at all, I'm a mere philosopher, but I've been very skeptical about that claim, and I'm going to offer at least three broad reasons for that kind of skepticism. In the first place, it would still be genetically different, and I've already sort of gestured at this. And because of the genetic differences, it would probably be phenotypically different, that is, different in body and behavior, in ways that might not be fully known, because not all of the genes that differ between the two species have been figured out, I think. Asian elephants, it turns out Asian elephants and woolly mammoths share about somewhere north of 99% of their DNA, but that still leaves over 1 million genetic differences found in about 1,600 genes. So the best case outcome, in my view, is essentially a modified Asian elephant, a hairy, cold-tolerant Asian elephant, not yet a mammoth. And the dire wolf scenario is similar. The dire wolf has a gray wolf genome modified at about 20 spots in 14 genes. The dire and gray wolf genomes also share about 99% of their DNA, but that also leaves millions of differences between them. In fact, the dire wolf and the gray wolf are not even in the same genus. Technically, the dire wolf wasn't a wolf. There's some debate about what it even looked like. The scientists at Colossal feel that they have solved that, but has been at least a competing camp that thinks that the dire wolf was reddish. It was more like a jackal, a very large muscular jackal, and not a wolf at all. So this genetic difference is often considered a sufficient reason right then and there to say that the two species are distinct from each other, and the modified Asian elephant isn't yet a woolly mammoth. But there would be some other biological differences as well. For example, the mammoth would have different mitochondria because the mitochondria are passed along through the egg's cytoplasm. So when you enucleate and stick in the new nucleus, you're left with the old mitochondria. But the mitochondria are key parts of the cell. They are the powerhouses. They are what provide energy for the cell. Particularly maybe with something that is has to have a metabolism capable of giving it cold hardiness, that might be a rather significant difference between the two species. Also, they would have a different microbiome and different parasites living on them and all that. The microbiome is the trillions of cells that live in you and on you. It turns out that each of you has more microbial cells in your, or about, actually, according to more recent research, about the same number, maybe more, microbial cells, more cells in the microbiome than you have of your own human cells. And they have a rather profound effect on health, mood, outlook. So in a way, at least for us humans, it becomes part of your identity, to the point that some people have even said, the whole idea of the human individual needs to be complicated a little bit. It's almost more like we're ecosystems ourselves. But the ecosystem of the mammoth would be a different ecosystem. So there are a few biological issues with some of these de-extinction claims. Let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, that these issues were overcome and that what we ended up with was exactly like the extinct species. Would it then be a mammoth? This leads to a third and more philosophical kind of point that I'm going to try to persuade you of. I think we could call it a perfect copy of a mammoth, but still not the mammoth. And the question here is, what is a species, actually? It turns out there are scads of definitions of definitions of what a species is. There are more definitions now than there were when people first began wrestling, scientists and philosophers of science first began wrestling with the problem of defining species. It's a highly technical topic. I don't have the chops, really, to wade through it. But I will offer here without argument that the dominant understanding, the understanding that makes most sense to me of species, is that of a lineage, where a lineage is a kind of a set that's constantly adding new members over time, and the new members are causally connected to the previous members. The previous members bring the new members into being. So mammoth begets mammoth begets mammoth. That's not how it would be with the de-extincted mammoth. They'd be modified continuations of Asian elephant lineages, or maybe you'd want to say that they've split off from that and it's a new lineage, but it's in effect a human creation, not a mammoth, even if it's identical to a mammoth. It would be kind of like if the Tower of Pisa fell down and people then rebuilt a perfect replica of the tower from new materials, let's say. Maybe that doesn't matter. But it would be, you have to imagine something that's exactly like the Tower of Pisa, but has been rebuilt from the ground up. Would it be the Tower of Pisa? Intuitively, I think not. And I think that's the case with a mammoth that was exactly like the original mammoth, but had been built. Colossal, the company that is doing this work, says, in effect, it's close enough. I think they're thinking of a species in one of two ways. Officially, they're employing a phenotypic definition of a species. If it looks and acts pretty much, as near as we can tell, like a mammoth, then mammoth it is. And frankly, they have to be, I think they are a little bit more concerned with the appearance than with the behavior of the mammoth. And they have, getting the domed head, for example. And they have to be, really, because it's easier to figure out the connection between the genes and the bodily phenotype than it is between genes and behavioral phenotype. It's really hard to know, in fact, what the behavioral phenotype was. Did the mammoth form herds? We can begin to guess at that probably from footprints, but we don't know very much about it. How did it travel? How did members interact with each other? What was the mating behavior? It's hard really to guess at all this. And some of the behavioral phenotype might also have been a matter essentially of mammoth culture, if you wish. Young are raised in behaviorally complex species. Young are raised by their parents, and they kind of learn how to be what they are through that raising process, that rearing process. So it's not just that mammoth begets mammoth, but mammoth teaches mammoth, and that line, too, is broken. So I think close enough is not good enough, but you can think here about some cases of convergent evolution. I'm going to get myself in trouble with the real experts in the room at this point, but where different species have evolved very, very similar forms and behaviors, like old and new world vultures. They look and behave much alike, but they remain different lineages. Or to dip into the hypothetical, sort of a science fiction-y kind of example, just imagine that you could make a robot that looked and acted exactly like mammoths. And maybe even imagine what's now impossible, that the robot is made out of organic materials. It's a carbon-based robot. It's been constructed. It exactly replicates a mammoth. Is it a mammoth? To me, intuitively, the answer there is no, it's really not. It's a creation. The folks at Colossal think that the objections like this are beside the point because, in fact, the mammoth would be genetically very, very similar to the new mammoth would be very, very similar to the extinct mammoth, not just phenotypically similar. And there is maybe another idea of a species that's operative here. Maybe this is the one, in fact, that's really operative. If it has the genome of a mammoth, or at least pretty nearly the genome of a mammoth, then it is a mammoth. This would reflect some common ideas that have a lot of cultural concurrency about genes and genomes. People sometimes think of the genome as the book of life, as former NIH Director Francis Collins used to put it, or as the operating software that sort of takes over the machine and makes a computer do what it does, as Craig Venter of the Craig Venter Institute once said. In my view, there's a kind of magical thinking here that comes out when we apply it to the de-extinction context. There's an idea that there's a kind of species essence, a sort of a Platonic form that captures the what-it-isness of that species, and the genome is the repository of that essence, so that if you write a new genome, the same letters and so forth, then you have, in effect, walked the species out of the dead. The idea of the species is eternal, could never quite be lost. The species was extinct only in the sense that it wasn't found on Earth anymore, but was there, and now it's brought back. Hence, elephant from heaven in the title. It existed somewhere, and now the colossal claim is it can be found on Earth again, and it's not really, it's the same thing because it never really went away. We've just sort of instantiated it again. And by contrast, the lineage understanding of a species is quite down to earth. Once the set with all of its internal causal connections is gone, the species is gone. All right, so this puts us in position to assess one of the arguments that's often offered, at least at sort of a pop level. I think this maybe got articulated early on in the National Geographic story on de-extinction, offered in favor of de-extinction, namely that by bringing a species that we help drive out of existence, we are righting a wrong. We wronged it by overhunting it, eliminating it, and we owe it to the species to bring it back. I don't think this can make sense for two reasons, actually. For one, if a species is a lineage, then when the line ends, that's it. That's the end of the line, literally. It cannot be brought back. So we're not righting the wrong. And if it's a kind of set, then we cannot owe anything to a set. So we're not actually, we cannot wrong a set, and so we don't have anything really to right. Now, I will say, I'm not going to try to defend this in great detail, but I will say that to me it does make sense to talk about value in nature. It can be a moral goal, I think, to try to limit the harm we do to existing natural phenomena, including to the mix of species that we find in the world. And it can make sense, too, I think, to talk about restoring natural systems, natural phenomena, and putting the original mix of species back into a system can be part of that process. So if we could do it, it could make some sense in certain cases. I'll get into this a little bit more in a moment. But it could make some sense to de-extinct species. But in fact, the best we can do is create a functional proxy, something that is different, that replaces it, that behaves in a very similar way, that takes its role in the ecosystem in some sense. We cannot bring mastodons back to Arkansas, but we could maybe import some, say, Asian elephants or African forest elephants and let them wander about and do somewhat mastodon-like things. There was an idea, actually the precursor of de-extinction is an idea called rewilding that endorsed exactly that plan of action. You wouldn't try to, it wasn't possible at that point to engage in all those technical tricks that I described and even pretend that you could de-extinct a mammoth, but you could find something that was somewhat similar and let it loose and fill that role. So all right, let's turn from the species question for a moment anyway and think about some of the broader conservation issues. How would this new creation do in the wild? Would it be useful to have it there? It's difficult, impossible really, to give a general answer here. It's going to, results will vary from one de-extinction project to another, but here are a handful of considerations to bear in mind, things to think about. First off, a species needs a certain population size and genetic diversity to survive. A very small, genetically limited population tends to fall into a so-called extinction vortex in which the inbreeding and drift within it just makes extinction inevitable. So you need to create not just 3 dire wolves, not just a few mammoths. You need to do the project over and over and over and over again, and with different genomes to give it the resilience to survive in the wild. So it's much more challenging. The technical triumph is only like a tiny part of the technical triumph that you need in order to achieve de-extinction. Second, the habitat might be gone. The mammoth lived in cold grasslands called Mammoth Steppe that do not exist anymore and would have to be restored probably for the mammoth really to function, certainly for it to function in the wild. Now, as I just said earlier a moment ago, one of the reasons for recreating a species might be that you want to try to restore a system, a lost ecosystem. But if that system is really fully lost, then recreating one species is not going to accomplish that. You need to recreate an entire web of things, and you might need to eliminate some other things from the system, species that have moved in and made it difficult for the species you want there to survive. And you might need to recreate certain background conditions like the climate and so forth. So the habitat problem is quite a significant problem. Third, and somewhat similarly, whatever drove the species extinct in the first place might well do so again. If you recreated a species of lost frog, a species that was wiped out by the chytrid fungus, but the chytrid fungus is still around, then you haven't obviously really accomplished anything. There was a species of dolphin, freshwater dolphin, that lived in the Yangtze River in China and has been mentioned as a candidate for de-extinction. But it is thought to have gone extinct because of water pollution, and the Yangtze River is still polluted. So there's really no point in putting that dolphin back in that river. The mammoth's extinction was probably is thought to be due to some mix of climate change and human hunting, and those problems still persist. Well, as the picture suggests, maybe the hunting issue can be addressed, but that brings up a different kind of problem. The mammoth might not be subject to hunting because it would be a fully managed, essentially domestic population. It might be preserved. It's been proposed in a Pleistocene park, not really just a national park, but really it's more like a game preserve that might be a real tourist attraction, as shown there. And then the question is that really a gain? Is that what you actually want if you're engaging in de-extinction? The environmental philosopher Holmes Rolston once said that what we want is not so much the species per se, but the species in the system. So there are a few lasting conservation problems, and these together, to me, suggest one further, maybe yet more perplexing kind of concern. Would de-extinction be a distraction from the real conservation problems? Would it turn our attention from what we need to do to address problems like hunting and pollution and climate change? It's an upbeat message. Would the sheer fact of having this upbeat message about extinction encourage people to think that they didn't need to worry about those problems anymore? If we lose a few, it's okay, we can bring it back, no big deal. Would it lead to a loss of funding for efforts to address these more basic, more systemic kind of conservation problems? I actually think the answers here are kind of complicated. The view from the de-extinction proponents is that a positive message is needed alongside the dire messages, that too much doom and gloom is impossible for people to bear. There needs to be something motivating, something positive to motivate people. The funding that goes to a startup like Colossal might be coming from a very, very different source from the funding that goes to, say, the World Wildlife Fund. And the technology that they're developing might be useful for conservation in a variety of other ways, maybe helping us to understand species, advance our genetic sequencing skills, understand genomes, develop assisted reproductive tools for other kinds of animals. Maybe it turns out that these high-profile cases like the dire wolf and the woolly mammoth are actually not really, they're the headline, but they're not the real story. That the real story is the science that they make possible that then can be applied to a variety of other much more kind of mundane, less headliney kinds of topics. And if you go to the Colossal website and you look at the work they're doing, there's a tremendous amount there that doesn't have to do with the woolly mammoth and the dire wolf. I'm not sure. These are all empirical questions. I really don't know what the answer is. Maybe folks here have opinions about it, but more grist for the mill, I suppose. All right, I've offered a very critical message, I think, so far. The new creatures aren't likely to succeed. They aren't a great conservation benefit. They wouldn't even really be de-extincted species. But there are some other stories that we probably need to be looking at. And maybe it turns out there's something a little bit different to say about some of them. So the little inset picture here is of a de-extincted Pyrenean ibex, a bucardo, which is a subspecies of the Spanish ibex. In the 19th century, the bucardo was hunted down to a remnant population. Actually, it was thought to be extinct, and then in the 20th century, a tiny little remnant population was discovered in a valley somewhere. That population also dwindled. In 1999, there was a single female left, was named Celia, and Celia was trapped, radio collared, and a few skin cells removed from her. A year later, in 2000, she died, and efforts were begun to clone her. The cloning process was really just like what I described for the dire wolf and the mammoth. The difference is that there was no genetic modification involved. It was just Celia's somatic cells inserted into an egg of a related species. In this case, it was a goat. And then they got some embryos, and they implanted those embryos into female goats. And in July of 2003, a live bucardo was born by C-section, this one. As you can tell, it didn't make it very long. It died after a few minutes. But for those few minutes, 7 minutes, the bucardo was no longer extinct, apparently. So a couple of things about this. I'm actually comfortable with saying that this was a bucardo and that extinction was reversed in this case. This kid was brought into the world with a lot of human intervention, but I don't really have a problem with the human intervention per se. I think of it as a little bit like the human intervention that's involved in bringing a human child into a family through IVF. When that first happened with Louise Brown, the so-called test tube baby, that was seen as sort of stepping outside the family structure, doing something. She was called the test tube baby. But we've since come to think, well, it's a different way of achieving procreation, but they aren't test tube babies. Test tubes are involved, but the lineage, really, if you wish, is maintained. Or you can think of it a little bit, a different comparison, like finding the seeds of a lost plant. There have actually been cases of plants, cold climate tundra plants, that are thought to have been out of existence for tens of thousands of years. Seeds are discovered and planted, and a lost plant comes back into the world. There's a huge gap, some human intervention, but something that was lost does then seem to have been brought back. Now, some of the other concerns I mentioned about the dire wolf and the mammoth are still live concerns for de-extinction of the bucardo. You need more than one or two of them. Whatever drove them into extinction in the first place is still a problem. The habitat for the bucardo is greatly reduced. Doesn't obviously count if you have nothing more than a captive breeding population. The bucardo story is also a nice story on which to hang one of the other concerns that some people have about de-extinction, which is that it's not great for the individual animals involved, even if it were good for the species. As has often been the case with cloning, it didn't go real swimmingly with the Bucardo. There were hundreds of attempts needed to create a few score of embryos. Most of the implantations failed. There were only 7 pregnancies, 6 of which miscarried. And then the kid that finally was born died after 7 minutes because of lung abnormalities, and or organic abnormalities like that are not terribly uncommon with animal cloning, at least of unfamiliar species. The direwolf story is somewhat similar. Colossal created 360 embryos, implanted 45 of them into 8 dogs over a series of efforts, and came up with these 3 pups. So there's a fair amount of potentially a fair amount of suffering. And then depending on the species, you could end up with something that doesn't quite know what to do with itself. If you de-extincted a passenger pigeon, they lived in enormous flocks. If you had there was one sad one left at the very end of the life of the passenger pigeon species. One, I think it was in a zoo in Cincinnati. People are nodding. That would have been a very perplexed passenger pigeon. It was used to being in a flock of billions, maybe. And so if you had, 3 woolly mammoths, what is life like for them? There are only a few other species that are even candidates for the cloning method. What limits it is that you need exceptionally good tissue, cells whose genetic material has not degraded. But there are a few candidates. This is one, the gastric brooding frog, and I feel like there's some sort of inside joke here that Okay.
It was mentioned yesterday.
Okay, good. It sounds like it was a pretty good panel yesterday. So the gastric brooding frog was remarkable because it turned its stomach into an incubating chamber, kind of turned its stomach into a uterus for its young. It went extinct in 1979 because of the chytrid fungus, and there was an effort called the Lazarus Project that had some preliminary success at cloning it, but the embryos didn't make it. They petered out after a while, and they couldn't figure out how to fix it, and the project was eventually dropped. Here's a third approach. We're sort of moving from the really high-tech to the somewhat more basic, although there's technology involved here. There's genetic sequencing in particular. This is the aurochs, an enormous animal that is the ancestor of all European cows. And it turns out that there are little bits of aurochs genome in today's cows. And if you pick the right cows, you might be able to breed an animal that combines those bits or many of those bits and turns out to look and act pretty much like the aurochs did. There are a couple of efforts underway to do this, and so far as I know, that work continues. Maybe this too would count as de-extinction. I think there's a debate about this, but I can sort of see a case being made for it. The creatures wouldn't be identical to the last true aurochs, which died in a Dutch zoo in 1627. But maybe you could say that they continued the aurochs lineage in some way. And some of the other conservation problems might be a little bit less significant for this. There are remnants of the forests in which the aurochs lived. They're degraded, but it's thought that having a functional proxy of an aurochs might help in more fully restoring those systems. So maybe even if you say, well, it's not really quite an aurochs, it's just much like an aurochs. It's no more like the aurochs than a poodle is like a wolf, say. But it'd be more of a functional proxy for the aurochs than a poodle is for a wolf, and maybe it would help. Maybe there'd be some point in doing that work, even if it's not exactly what it was. There are very few species that can be brought back this way. In fact, it's mostly subspecies. The quagga, subspecies of zebra has been mentioned, and some subspecies of the Galapagos tortoise are candidates for it. All right, this is my favorite de-extinction story. The American chestnut is considered functionally extinct. It's not fully gone. There are a few of them out there, about 1,000, but it's not doing what it did. It has no meaningful role in ecosystems anymore. There used to be billions of them, around 4 billion, I think it's thought, across eastern North America. They were wiped out in the early 20th century by chestnut blight, a fungal disease that was accidentally imported from Asia. There's now another disease that also poses a threat, especially actually here in Arkansas, probably, and in Tennessee, my home state, Phytophthora root rot in the southern part of the former chestnut range. It might be as big a problem as chestnut blight, but chestnut blight is the thing that really wiped them out. There are 3 ways in which the American chestnut might come back. One is there are about 1,000 trees remaining, and maybe you could find some trees that have some resistance to the blight and breed them to produce a tree that has more resistance. There are occasional stories one finds in the media about this, but I think that my impression is that those stories are floated a little bit more to try to counter the other 2 stories, that there's not very much, doesn't look very likely. There are only 1,000 trees. There's probably not whatever resistance there was in the American chestnut was probably lost when the 4 billion trees were lost. A lot of those were clear cut in advance of the blight hitting them so that the lumber could be used. So the other 2 ways to bring back the American chestnut, one consists in crossbreeding the American chestnut with the Asian chestnut, which has pretty considerable blight resistance. And then you'd end up with a mixed hybrid thing, and you backbreed it with more American chestnuts to try to create specimens that have the collection of genes that confers blight resistance, but otherwise has only American or has mostly American chestnut genes. So you'd have something that has the growth habit of an American chestnut. They were great, tall, magnificent trees. They were called the redwoods of the East. The Asian chestnut is a somewhat smaller tree. Turns out this effort's been underway for decades, and it continues, but there are, I think, according to my understanding, there are 3 genes that are involved in the Asian chestnut that are needed to confer blight resistance. They're found at different spots. And getting a tree that has those genes together but is otherwise an American chestnut has proved very, very difficult. So a third strategy is to produce blight resistance through genetic modification. There are various other plants that have genes that can give blight resistance, will fend off the blight. And the species that's been chosen for this work is wheat. So you take a wheat gene and you insert it into a chestnut tree, and in principle you might end up with a tree that has got the full American genome, American chestnut genome, but with blight resistance added. This work too, there's a big complicated story about how this work has gone, and certainly it's not yet been resoundingly successful, but the scientists who've been working on it, who are at the State University of New York Environmental Sciences and Forestry program, believe that they're on track and can succeed. And here's me with one of their I learned that there was one of these trees in the New York Botanical Garden, and it's not labeled anywhere, but I asked around, and somebody told me, oh yeah, you go down this way and that way, and I found it. It's a little shrubby. It doesn't really have the right growth habit. And I asked the scientist, I mentioned this to the scientist, the lead scientist doing this work, and he agreed. This isn't the latest version. This is from a number of years ago, as you can tell, given how different I look in this picture. But, and this tree is no longer there. They took it down. He believes, I think, that the specimens that they have now are closer in growth habit to the original thing. I think a case could be made. I'm actually, this is a controversial endeavor. There's been a huge rift. There's a nonprofit foundation called the American Chestnut Foundation that has sometimes supported this work and then retracted their support, and there's been a huge rift. I'm actually sort of a proponent of it, frankly. I think it would be interesting to see it go forward. And I think the case could be made that this would be a continuation of the American chestnut lineage, and it would be more likely a continuation of the American chestnut lineage than whatever you got from the crossbreeding program, which people have not been that has not been controversial. People have not really objected to that on sort of human meddling grounds. From my perspective, this involves sort of less problematic human meddling, frankly. There aren't too many things that can be brought back this way that are threatened. But there are well, actually, let me back up. No, there are very many things that are threatened, and with one or another form of human intervention can be assisted. These are ferrets that they're being brought back through a cloning effort that's very much like what I described for the bucardo. But there are species of, and no genetic modification with these. But then there are other things that coral species, the sunflower sea star. There are lots of things that some combination of genetic modification and reproductive technology might turn out to be somewhat useful. So what these examples show to me is that there is a lot of value in the science, a lot of promise for helping to rescue species that are on the verge of extinction or are sliding toward the verge. But the examples that I started with, the high-profile cases like the mammoth and the direwolf, look to me more like creative scientific play, actually, than science in the service of conservation. And this brings me to Anzu Wiley and the Chickenosaurus. Anzu Wiley was a dinosaur that's been dubbed the chicken from hell because its fossils were discovered in the Hell Creek Formation in Montana, and because it would have looked like a chicken from hell. It was about twice my height, weighed about 500 pounds, but had roughly the body plan of a chicken. Claws, it was feathered, claws instead of wings. It had a beak instead of teeth. It would be really cool to see one. There's no question about it. Now, it happens that there are some scientists, paleontologists, led by paleontologists, who have proposed that genome editing of actual chickens could produce a chicken-like dinosaur, or maybe a dinosaur-like chicken. It would be way smaller than the chicken from hell, but way more fearsome than a barnyard chicken. And they think that we might learn something from the science. There'd be sort of collateral benefits from doing this work. We might learn something about genes, about embryogenesis, maybe about the relationship of dinosaurs to birds, and that it would be super cool to see one. And I think it's the super cool part that really motivates the idea and motivates the de-extinction of the mammoth and the direwolf. And it gives me pause about some of this work. A few years ago, I was telling Drew, I participated in a debate about de-extinction at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And I think that there were three arguments for de-extinction of the woolly mammoth. That's what we were talking about mainly there, that were floated. One is the kind of we owe it to the species sort of argument. We need to bring this species back. I've talked about that. I don't really think that that argument quite makes sense. Another is that it would be environmentally useful because the mammoths would clear snow from the ground, which would help the ground to freeze during the winter, which would stop the ground from releasing methane, which would be helpful for slowing climate change because methane is a very, very powerful greenhouse gas, quite a bit worse than carbon dioxide. Interesting. It's an intriguing idea. The problem is, of course, you need tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of them in order to make a difference for climate change, and there's no way that that's going to happen fast enough for it to make a difference. And then the third argument is that it would lead to other scientific advances. At the debate, George Church, who was sitting right next to me, and George is the scientist who helped create Colossal, suggested that to get a lot of mammoths, you can't just rely on Asian elephant moms or African elephant moms. You really need to develop artificial elephant uteruses. And that would be a really, really helpful thing. Because maybe that would then lead to work that would make possible human artificial uteruses. And I had this kind of like head-spinning moment. There's nothing wrong with offering, there might well be a variety of reasons. If it's worth going forward, there might be a variety of reasons to go forward with it. But I found myself wondering, is that really the fastest way to get human artificial uteruses? And I sort of had this feeling that what we have is a goal, a plan that's in search of a rationale, in search of an argument. And I think none of the rationales that are on offer are what really are driving the work. I think what's really driving the work, what's really getting funding into Colossal, and Colossal is very well funded, is the cool factor. It's really super cool. It's about playfulness. So one more species, I thought this might be an appropriate one for today, this audience. There's something in all this work that resonates with me. There's a sense of wonder, an appreciation, a desire for understanding. There's even a feeling of connection to the natural world in it. I believe that what motivates Beth Shapiro, the lead scientist at Colossal, who's a genius at the sequencing problem. I think what really motivates her or them to do it are some conservation goals. But there's also something that's unsettling in it for me. I think nature is conceived somewhat more as something for us to take control of than to conserve. The title of George's book, which I had on the slide back, it was next to the National Geographic cover. The title of that book from a few years ago captures this view very powerfully, I think. The title is Regenesis, How Synthetic Biology Will Reinvent Nature and Ourselves. I think the vision here, I'm not opposed to human interference. I think I've made that clear. But the vision here is of humans standing over nature and taking control, dominating it, replacing it with what they want to see there. And the vision I would prefer is of humans in nature, inevitably changing it, sometimes managing it, intervening to save species, maybe on occasion, doing something that could be counted as de-extinction. But to some degree, simply trying to make room for it and to find ways of coexisting with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaebnick. We have some time for questions, and so if you do have a question, please raise your hand. We want the microphone for those who are watching online. So if you have questions, raise your hand. I'll come and bring the microphone.
Somebody was asking was trying to figure. You were trying to figure out what was more intriguing to you. What have you, the chicken from hell or the elephant from heaven?
Chicken from hell. Quick.
Eric.
So I'm a little interested in the lineage story and the notion of a causal connection, because I think I was following you about like the gap, causal gap. But then it occurred to me before you got to the other cases, well, there's just a different kind of causal chain. It's not really a gap. It's caused ultimately by the deposited material that contains the genome. And then you got to the case where you're talking about, skipping ahead, the human in vitro fertilization, continuing the lineage. That also has kind of a wonky, non-traditional causal connection that doesn't look like the normal one that generates a lineage. And then the intermediate case you wanted to reject, I don't remember what that was. What was the other case you talked about?
The intermediate one I wanted to reject.
So the mammoths are not okay, the humans okay, the trees are okay. So, but it just makes me wonder, like, what exactly is the causal connection that's present for IVF that makes it a lineage, and that is lacking in the woolly mammoth that prevents it from being a lineage?
Okay. Well, I mean, I might be wrong about this, but here's, I mean, and let me preface what I'm going to say by saying that I don't think that there are really clear answers. You had me saying one is in, the other's out. One counts, the other doesn't. And I really don't think it's quite as clear as that. I sort of think that there's a gray area. And I'm not sure what to say about some of the cases in the middle, like the aurochs. For me, the Bucardo seems like it's okay. That is okay, I think. So my thought is that that kid actually did have the genome of earlier of Celia, the Bucardo that died in 2000. You're absolutely right. The manner of procreation is different from that of the lineage. The kid wasn't brought into the world just with through natural procreation. But I mean, yeah, to me, it does look like a continuation of the line.
You're giving us a case like, if we imagine the woolly mammoth, we got the diversion story, they got the genome to match perfectly, and then you were saying it's the lack of the right kind of causal connection in this imaginary case where they linked up perfectly that makes this not actually a mammoth. And that's what kind of threw me. It's like, okay, so it sounds like it's not just causation that you're looking at in the aurochs case, it's also things that are matching. But then in the case of the imaginary case where the mammoth gets that close, I don't see how the lineage story is supposed to be different.
Interesting. Yeah.
It's not raised by genetics.
Right, but
How much is
so
it genetic and how much is behavioral?
that's sort of my question, is like, what's the relevant causal connection that generates the continuation of the species? Because there's causal connections across all the cases that you gave different answers to. They just differ.
That's true. Yeah, it might be, maybe I'm making a little bit too much of the genome. Maybe I'm falling a little bit into the mistake that I was accusing some of the de-extinction proponents of thinking of the genome as kind of the repository of species essence. But to me, there's something a little bit, I don't know, intuitively. There's the sort of the vision of the human involvement in that is it's greater if you're taking bits and pieces from different places and sort of recreating it, than if you're taking a piece of taking a cell from a Bucardo, and I can't. I mean, it's a little bit. I mean, it's a kind of a judgment. I don't have a really clear story for what kinds of genetic interventions are acceptable, or what kinds of human interventions break that causal chain in a way that makes me think, no, that wouldn't count. I certainly don't think that there's a clear spot where, oh, that's too much. I mean, for me, yeah, I don't know. That's kind of said what I can say, I guess.
Hang on. I had the exact same question, but I thought the most compelling case that you made was the microbial symbionts, and their role in behavior and so on and so forth. So I don't know if the goats example would improve, meaning there would be more of those symbionts in nature because it just went extinct versus the woolly mammoth.
Yeah, it's an interesting, very interesting question.
But I thought that was
Yeah. And that kind of transmission would probably mostly be vertical, and then that vertical transmission might have been broken in the Bucardo case. So that might be a further reason to think that, yeah, interesting.
I'll go ahead and throw a question out there, actually. And this comes from a position of naivete about philosophical views and how immutable or not they are. You described to us these various cases, and some of them are appropriate, some of them maybe not. Do we get to a point where the trashing of the planet through human activity brings us that much closer to the loss of more species, or loss of species at a faster rate, where the philosophical argument for or against de-extinction changes? That needle moves from one end of the spectrum or the other.
That's an interesting one. I'm not sure that it would change. If by philosophical argument you meant the account of species, I'm not sure that it would affect that consideration at all. But we could get to a point where we need, I mean, in principle, I'm just imagining things, but we could get to a point where we need to create species in order to have functioning ecosystems. And if you take, as an environmentalist, if you take a fundamentally holistic view of what it is you're trying to preserve, rather than focusing too much on individual species that you want to bring back, and that would be that would rest on philosophical kinds of considerations, maybe in part. There'd be ecosystem services that you'd be interested in, which are one thing. But if you're finding some sort of inherent value in nature, but you take a sort of holistic view of what it is that you're finding has inherent value, then maybe you'd want to engage in. You'd find yourself getting to a tipping point, or you needed to engage in species recreation in order to try and keep the systems going. That's kind of the story, I guess, and with the aurochs, but ramped up quite a lot. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Do you envision that there would be an issue with possibly reintroducing an extinct species, creating more ecological problems than what they were put there to fix? Like, for example, you mentioned with the mammoths that they could knock down the snow and the ground would get colder and you'd get less methane in the air. But it seems to me if you had a large enough herd of mammoths, they themselves are going to be generating an awful lot of methane by feeding on vegetation. So, what's your take on that?
I don't know what to say about the mammoth. That is, something like that has been mentioned, I think, about the passenger pigeon. They were in flocks of literally billions of birds. It could take like a day for a flock to fly overhead. And when they roosted in a forest, it sounded like a tornado, apparently. And the birds would alight in the trees in such numbers. They were largish birds, and they would alight in the trees in such numbers that they would break branches after they had passed. After the flock had passed through it, it looked like there had been a storm. And you can imagine. I mean, one of the reasons that we might not want to engage in full de-extinction of the passenger pigeon is that no one really wants to have such large flocks around, that much bird poo, and that much, imagine some wildlife refuge in Arkansas, a flock, a really substantial flock of passenger pigeons lands in it and could do a fair amount of. I don't know. I'm sort of spitballing here, but yeah, I suppose.
I'd like to see it, anyway, thank you.
Yeah.
We are out of time for questions. I want to honor the time we've had, so please join me in thanking Dr. Kaebnick.
Thank you very much.
A couple of quick announcements. One, another plug for the exhibit. If you want to see a specimen of a passenger pigeon, we have one. Hey, yeah. Exhibit, so that ties in. Second thing is we have a questionnaire here, so if you use your phones to access with this QR code, please take a few minutes. We're curious of your feedback. Third, we have a brief reception, where if you want to continue the conversation with others here or with Dr. Kaebnick, if you exit out of the door at the bottom here and take a right, the door at the end of the hall has some snacks and things in there. You're welcome to join us. So thank you again for attending. Please attend the exhibit, and hope to see you at the reception. Thank you.